Mike is out today, so you're with me, Al Souza. I'm a certified financial planner and with Adams Financial Concepts. And we have an interesting show today. We're going to talk about the current state of the economy and the Fed trying to unwind their $9 trillion balance sheet, which is really unprecedented. We'll get more into that in a few minutes. In our second section, we're going to talk to an economist with Seattle City Light, John Rudolf, and talk about electrification, which is you're no longer going to be able to have gas furnaces, gas ranges at some point. Right now, if you're building new commercial, you cannot use them at all electric right now. And in the last section, we're going to talk about some new startling demographics changes that are going on that I think are going to have a long-term effect on the economy and production. So stick around. But let's talk about the Fed right now. Let's talk about the economy, which we've talked about before. We've kind of touched on it, but let's break it down a little bit. So right now, the Fed is sitting out with a $9 trillion balance sheet. At the same time, they're raising interest rates by 0.5%. What they want to do is they want to deleverage their portfolio of bonds by $95 billion a month. They're going to start that in September. Now, some predicted that it would act like another quarter-point rate hike on top of the 0.5% rate hike that they're already doing. The problem with that is that nobody really knows. Powell met with Biden last week, and Biden came out of it saying that he's not going to meddle with the Fed's policy making. Now, history tells us that we're never going to really know what happened in that meeting probably for years, but most presidents of the past, say, 50 years have meddled with the Fed. I think you've heard Mike say that Lyndon Johnson tried to get McChesney, who was the Fed chief at the time, to lower interest rates because of the war. Nixon tried to get Arthur Burns to lower interest rates in the 70s. And even Ronald Reagan tried to meddle with Paul Volcker in the early 80s when Volcker knew that he had to raise interest rates to stop high inflation. And we saw Trump do it in 2017 when the market dropped on it was a December day right before Christmas, and the market dropped precipitously because there was threats that he was going to fire Powell. So I want to talk about that, but I want to talk about, there's been some new recent comments from CEO of Chase Bank and CEO of Bank of America contrasting opinions about what the economy is going to do. Jamie Dimon was negative about the economy. He's basically saying here, if I can find my note here, saying that the economy is headed for an economic hurricane. He does not see how we can avoid a recession. He points to three factors: the war in Ukraine, unwinding the Fed's balance sheet, and government-fueled consumer spending. Because the government, when Trump came in office, they spent money, which everybody agreed that had to be done to keep the economy and things afloat. And Biden doubled down on that spending and continues to want to he got a bill passed in 2021, $1.7 trillion, and he wants to get another bill passed here that was Build Back Better. They changed the name to something else. I don't know, but they're hoping to get that done in the fall. And that'd be somewhere around, I think, another $2 trillion. But I want to focus on what the Bank of America, Brian Moynihan, said. He said that Moynihan points to steady consumer spending, plentiful jobs, and solid wage gains, and making the case that the U.S. is unlikely to tumble into a recession anytime soon. Economists surveyed by Bloomberg put the odds at about 30%. Who's right? I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, unwinding this economy in this position we've never been before. The best analogy I can think of, it's kind of like when you think about doing a major remodel on your house and you're going to do it by yourself. It's real easy to start taking the drywall down, pulling the electrical out, cutting 2x4s. It's the putting back together that's really difficult, and that's where I think we're in, is that we've never been in this position before, and they've never had to unwind a balance sheet this large, and they don't know how they're going to do it. So my next point here is that Ray Diella wrote a book. He's the head of Bridgewater Associates. He runs a $160 hedge fund, and he said he thinks that the country's in decline, and that in the last 40 years, America's been declining, and that China's going to take over and be the world currency. And he has a 6 six-part scale that he uses for that, and he says we're in stage 5 right now. The decline is, we have a great disparity in wealth, we have high crime, and we have polarization of political polarization, and those factors contribute to a decline of a country's economic power. He says he sees that happening. Moreover, he says that in the last 300 years or so, that the American dollar has been the dominant currency for the last, say, 100 so years. Before that, it was the British pound. Before that, it was the Dutch guilder was the dominant currency. He says we're coming up to 100 years here, and we're about to age out of being the dominant currency. So where do we go from here? Well, that being said, we have still supply chain bottlenecks. We have COVID lockdowns in China that's contributing to that supply chain. And we're bringing back necessary goods that are not just necessary goods, but goods being produced, like Intel's opening a major plant in I think it's Iowa. And right now, where we have a job market where we can't fill jobs, and we have people that are aging out of the workforce, what's going to happen? Where are we going to go with if we keep that going? Could that cause more inflation? And that talking about that, looking at whether we've been in we're a global economy. What happens around the world and happens in China, like what happened in 2015 when Janet Yellen was Fed chief and started raising interest rates, and she saw that something was happening wrong with the Chinese currency, and she had to stop what she was doing and reverse course. So the question now, and a lot of people have been writing about, is globalization over? I mean, people were talking about it before COVID. They were talking about when Trump started tariffs with China and wars, and now with COVID and with the war in Ukraine, people are starting to pick their factions of who wants to be who's going to trade with each other. So I got some interesting. There's some interesting. Let's see. I can't find my notes here. 1 second. So one thing I've been reading from I think it was the Heritage Foundation, I believe. No, I'm sorry. It was Dow Jones. Is that talking about globalization? Is Russian aggression in Ukraine is subsequently decoupling the global economy is going to prompt companies and governments worldwide to reevaluate their dependency and reanalyze their manufacturing and assembling footprints, something that COVID has already spurred many to start doing it, Fink says. On the other side of that, the head of the WTO, I can't pronounce her name very well, but I'm going to try. It's Gozi Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization, who this week tells Minnie Zinton, the economist chief and editor of the World Supply Chain, that the supply chain is too complex to break apart, and that it's going to be really difficult to decouple us from the globalization that we're in. But globalization for the United States, has helped us keep inflation low by finding cheap labor around the world. Now that China is starting to become more industrialized, where are we going to go to find the cheap labor needed to keep inflation low? Here's one from BlackRock founder Larry Fink that says that Russia-Ukraine war is bringing the era of globalization to an end, but investors keep in mind that the global economy and the financial systems can't turn on a dime, analysts say. So there's a lot of moving parts here to this economy that we have no idea of what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen with the war in Ukraine. We don't know what's going to happen with the Fed unwinding their balance sheet. We don't know when COVID's going to end. And so it's going to be a very precarious world for the next couple of years. And I kind of agree with Jamie Dimon that we're going to be in for it for a while. Mike is on the more positive side, thinks that this is going to end pretty quickly. But I think if the government keeps spending money and they keep raising interest rates at the same time, and this war starts to stranglehold and take more of Europe in in causing energy supply to be constrained, we're going to be in for it. We got about 20 seconds here. I got to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back, and we'll be talking with John Rudolf.
Hi.
How you doing, John? Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
No problem. I'm doing pretty well.
Good. So tell us about Seattle City Light's plan for electrification.
Sure. So Seattle City Light recently completed an electrification assessment working with EPRI. It's a very detailed study. There's quite a bit of documentation online for those that are interested. I'll step back, and maybe for some of the listeners that aren't familiar with the term electrification, essentially what it means is taking a certain technology that is primarily driven by fossil fuel and converting it to using electricity. And the term electrification has been getting more attention recently, but electrification is actually not a new thing. Electrification has been going on since electricity was invented, and actually one of the first commercial applications of electricity was converting gas-powered street lighting to electric-powered lighting. And so electrification is really just taking a technology that is primarily fossil fuel-based and having it run on electricity instead, and it's really been going on for quite a long time. What is different now when the term electrification is used is that it's generally referring to decarbonization. And so this is sort of the new part of electrification, is that a lot of electrification now is driven by the goal to decarbonize, reduce the use of fossil fuels, to limit greenhouse gas emissions, to slow global warming, whereas in the past, electrification was more driven by technology choice for convenience or comfort or cost reasons, and now the big push is really those things, but also decarbonization is the big goal too.
Right.
And so, yeah. And so for the city of Seattle, and I think what this means for folks that are living in Seattle, what electrification means is there's really two sectors. The two big sectors I would look at are transportation and buildings. Those are the two main sectors where we're going to see electrification happening in the next 10 or 20 years.
Okay. Now, according to, I read some of your study there that you sent me. I appreciate that. I picked out something on page 1-10. It says in the 100% electrification scenario, the energy required to fuel electric vehicles, both light duty and MDHD, is approximately 90 times greater than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
My question is how is the grid system, is it robust enough to support that?
So that's a good question, and that's why you see a number of these electrification studies being conducted, and really it's the studies are kind of a starting point. I think the answer to that question is still getting figured out. What I would say is that the way that the grid and the system is configured today, it's really designed to meet electricity demand when it is the highest. And so in the Pacific Northwest right now, electricity demand still is the highest in the wintertime.
Right.
And so at most times of the year, there is available capacity on the grid to meet new electrification loads. Most of the time, there's available resources to meet electricity demands. And so when you're thinking about electrification, the challenge isn't really over the next 5 years or so. It's really 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, 20 years down the road, if most modes of transit are electrified and most buildings are fully electrified and there is substantial load growth, it could pose some challenges, but the challenges are probably not insurmountable. It would require adding more resources, probably building out portions of the grid that are maybe a little bit more stressed than other portions.
Right.
Connecting making the larger Western grid a little bit more interconnected connected, so you can move electricity from one part of the grid more efficiently to another part.
Right.
And then I would say the other piece that maybe gets a little bit less attention is that there's a lot of new technology coming out that enables, it's called load shifting technology. So you have the ability maybe to charge your electric vehicles, for example, at times of the day where the grid is less stressed, and you can apply that sort of technology to other devices, to heating in the home or water heating. And so load flexibility is a big component of that. And I really think that all those things are going to happen under a rapid electrification sort of scenario that you were talking about there.
Right, but City of Seattle wants it done by 2030. Is that feasible? That it'll be completely 100% electrical, 100% electrification by 2030.
So I don't think the question was about whether we wanted to. It was an exploratory. In this case, it was an exploratory view of whether or not what would happen under that scenario. Whether it's feasible or not is dependent on certain policies and how the market evolves and how technology evolves.
Right. But okay, just the case I was reading this morning about because they're having a huge heat wave down south. They're seeing the potential blackouts and brownouts down in Texas. Would that be an issue if we go just full electrification? Is that a possibility that we'd see more blackouts and brownouts?
Well, there's in the power world, you do resource adequacy studies, and that's what you're trying to solve during a resource adequacy study.
Right.
And so and these are the sort of things that City Light and different utilities are looking at. Right. When they're doing their resource adequacy studies, is they look at these different scenarios and say, okay, does it look like we're in a condition where we might be short of resources? If so, then we're going to have to put in a plan in place to procure more resources.
Right.
And so that's something that utilities are looking at. And so it's sort of what I got back to, where within the next few years, electrification load growth is really not something that's going to cause any immediate resource adequacy issues on the grid.
Right.
It would be 15 or 20 years from now, and hopefully the resource adequacy planning that utilities are doing now would be identifying those issues in the future, and you're starting to be building out new resources, building out those systems that need to accommodate that new load growth.
Right. So from what I read, I was just reading something from the CEO of Eaton. They make a bunch of electrical components, saying that we're years and hundreds of billions of dollars away from 100% electrification around the country. Yeah,
it's not going to be an easy thing to reach 100% electrification.
Now, let me ask you this question: Seattle goes all green and we're all electrification, but the power source, where is the power going to come from? Will that be green or renewables, or will that have to be? What source will that power come from?
Yeah, so one thing I want to make clear is that I'm sort of representing my own views here.
Right.
I'm not speaking directly to what the city of Seattle is and their electrification plan. So right. I do want to make that clear, because I don't want to misrepresent the city of Seattle's position or City Light's position.
Sure.
And so it's sort of the Twitter disclaimer I'm giving you now.
Right.
So your question is, where is the additional power going to come from?
Right.
Yeah, and so I think this is where you're going to have to look at. There's already been quite a bit of new resources from solar, from wind. I think one of the things that's probably needed is more connection to solar and wind, so regional transmission. So I think one of the big things that's going to happen if you wanted to have a lot more resource build out is more connection from places where you have more solar generation to places like the Northwest.
Right.
I think the Northwest is an important part of the equation, especially on the West Coast, because of our abundant hydro generation. And so there is some synergy there when you get a lot of hydro generation and connecting that to solar generation itself. If you expand transmission, I think that there's a lot of benefit that can come from there. And so there is probably the possibility in the future that in a way, the Northwest kind of acts as a bit like a big battery with its hydro generation, and it's able to exchange energy with different parts of the country further south that have more solar generation. And so I think that is going to be a big part of the equation going forward as more solar gets built out, as more wind gets built out.
Right.
Broader
But
connection.
we saw some of those fail, though, like in Texas a few years ago when they had the storm. We saw in France where their wind systems failed because of the wind did not blow the way they thought it was going to blow. So how do you account for that if those systems are going to be not as consistent as, say, burning fossil fuels?
So I do think that that's where you have some kind of backup capacity. I think hydro can be a good backup capacity when you have wind not blowing or the sun not shining. I think the other thing, like I was talking about, is if you have a broader, if you expand your transmission access and you include more areas, you're more likely to have areas where the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. So when you expand that footprint of where the regional grid connects to, it can balance out some of those fluctuations in weather that you're talking about.
Okay. Do you see nuclear as a part of this?
And also, you're also talking about a case where everything, the case you're talking about is 20, 30 years down the road. And right now, a lot of that backup capacity is provided by dispatchable resources like natural gas. And so I don't think this is a situation where you just snap your fingers and, all the regional natural gas is shut off. I think it's a transition away there's a transition away from it.
I agree. I have a friend in real estate who does developments, and right now all the buildings, he's saying, have to be, they've already permitted that where they all have to be electric. There's no more gas they can use in those, so they're already starting that process.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you see nuclear as a modular nuclear?
I think it's an interesting new technology. I think there's potential there. I think the issue with conventional nuclear is it can be really expensive to build conventional new nuclear plants. So I do think
I'm sorry, John, I got to cut you off here. We got to wrap this up. But John, I really appreciate you coming on, taking the time and answering my questions.
Creating and maintaining wealth has been the specialty of Adams Financial Concepts for over 20 years. Every portfolio managed by Adams Financial Concepts is customized to fit each particular client's objectives and risk tolerance. The client's interest always comes first in portfolio decisions. Call Mike Adams today at 206-903-1019 or log on to adamsfinancialconcepts.com to check out their AFC performance. They welcome your review. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Hi, I'm back here. And we have some startling new statistics on marriage and birth rates. And you ask, why does that matter? Because the three things we look at Adams Financial Concepts when we're looking at investments is changes in technology, changes in lifestyle, and changes in demographics. This is a huge change in demographics that people are getting married, and there's been more marriages because of COVID. They put them off, so 2021 and 2022, they've off the charts for marriages. But people having less kids, a lot less kids. And that has a reverberating effect for the economy long term. And there's an article in Barron's over the weekend that I'm going to use because there's some great numbers on statistics on that. So they say the factors declining birth rates are complex and multifaceted, including changing views on marriage, growing and worries about the future among young couples, and new financial pressures. I think there's always been financial pressures on couples. I mean, I know I have 3 kids, and they talk about people being scared to have kids, and I'm just kind of looking, I shake. I think everybody's scared to have kids. Nobody knows what kind of parent they're going to be. You just you do the best you can, I guess. But these statistics, they end from this. So Ronald D. Demographer, an economist at the University of California, Berkeley, shows that annual GDP growth slowed to 1.2 percentage points from 2010 to 2020 due to population aging, according to preliminary projections. So what problems it's going to raise for the economy is growth. You can't have a growing economy if you don't have a growing population. Robert Sola, who's a professor, my wife told me not to say emeritus at MIT. He's been there since I think 1949. Wrote the quintessential economic growth model, and one of them tenets is population growth, and the other one of them is technology. But a recent study I read from the Philadelphia Fed pointing out that, excuse me, I mentioned it briefly a couple of weeks ago, but I didn't really dive into it, is that technology is not producing the productivity that it did in the past. We just spoke to John about electrification, John Randolph from the city of Seattle. And he's right, electrification is not something new. It's been going on for 100 years. But when electrification started in the 1800s with the advent of the light bulb, it transformed the economy, because from the light bulb we had the automobile and things like that came out of it. But the study that I read said that he doesn't think the technology from the Philadelphia Fed, that technology this is in 2016, is going to be transformative in the sense that it's going to have all these offshoots of it that are going to make humans more productive. That being said, you can see why there's been a push in the last, I'd say 10 years for this thing called universal basic income. I think Mark Zuckerberg was one of the people pushing that. And, that's basically attuned to saying that, we're not going to be as productive, so we got to pay people to not work. And, and governments try to make policy, right? They try to make fiscal policy to spur the economy. The problem with fiscal policy spurring the economy is that it doesn't work, especially in the short term. Like the $1.7 trillion package that passed to fix bridges and roads, and some of it was used I believe, to improve the grid, the electrical grid. It's going to take years for it to pay off, to actually be productive and increase productivity. But just let me read you the birth rates here from this article. So the U.S. fertility rates have been falling since the end of 2008 and 2009, reaching all-time lows of 56 births per 1,000 women in 2020. 5 years after the end of World War II, the fertility rate was 106.2 per 1,000 women. In the 80s, it was escalated from around 65 to 69. Now women are expected to have 1.66 children over a lifetime. That's a slight increase over 2020, which was 1.64. But both rates are below the so-called replacement level of fertility rates of 2.1. So basically, we're not having enough children to replace the people that are going to basically die and age out of the workforce. We do have immigration, which we fight over immigration policy, but immigration is one of Robert Sola's parts of his growth model. And we do need immigration, and there's this fight over what they called replacement theory. I don't want to get political, but there is really a replacement theory, because we need new births to take over the people that are going to age out of the workforce. And so immigrants do come over and actually have more kids. So that is one way. But if you look at other countries that are going through this too, China has a terrible problem with aging. And they're a huge aging population. And they're also not having enough kids. They even tried to, they had a one-child policy for years. They got rid of that, I think, some 5-7 years ago, and it still didn't work. They're still not having enough kids to move their economy along. Japan went through a whole decade of just no growth, zero growth at all. They've been on negative interest rates because their population is aging and they weren't having enough children. So this has a huge effect on the economy. And to go back what I said in the first segment with Ray Diallo's book, saying a declining country because we had an aging population, and really, but we're the only country that really allows immigration. Immigration can come along and basically save the day for us to increase economic growth in this country. The thing is that in this country, we tend to take a short-term view as opposed to a long-term view of everything. We want everything to happen right now. And that being said, we need to... can I stop that for a second? Okay. All right. So we talked about growth rates in China. And we talked about government spending. The irony is, I've mentioned is that government spending does not increase productivity or economic output. Back during the Great Depression, we saw that the government spent money and unemployment still stayed at 20%. During Obama's term after the Great Recession, they passed a $778 stimulus package, yet it didn't do anything to move the needle, and unemployment still rose above 10%. The question is, what do we do to how do we increase productivity? So where am I going with all this? Well, as I said in the beginning of the section, is that there's three things that we look at Adams Financial Concepts. We look at changes in demographics, change in lifestyle, and change in technology. I think we covered all three today. I mean, we're seeing with the demographics, we're seeing women having less children. We're seeing an aging workforce. With electrification, we're seeing the economy of the city of Seattle being transformed. And I think in other cities I know are starting to do this and transforming electricity to get rid of hydrocarbons. And lastly, where is this going to take the economy? Where are we going to go from here? How is the Fed going to unwind the $9 trillion balance sheet? I want to talk a little more about Jerome Powell. I mean, he's much more straight shooter than some of our past Fed chiefs. I remember always watching Alan Greenspan on CNBC, and I have to laugh because they used to have Fed watches, and they'd watch and they'd hang on every word that Alan Greenspan said because nobody could actually figure out sometimes what he was talking about. I remember the host of that show was Maria Bartiromo in the 90s, and every time Alan Greenspan came on, it was sometimes comical. But Powell's not like that. He's much more straightforward in his speak. He speaks plain speak, just like Ben Bernanke did, and Janet Yellen did also. But let's get back to what Jamie Dimon said about that he thinks that we're in for a storm here. And, we have the other Brian Moynihan from Bank of America saying, no, everything's going to be fine. And, I'm much more of an optimist, the silver lining, but I just don't see how this is going to play out without some pain for the American people, because as I said, we've never had to unwind a $9 trillion balance sheet. And even some of the things I read about when Ben Bernanke started quantitative easing, we've never done quantitative easing. It wasn't something that was done till 2008. Ben Bernanke spent his time studying the Great Depression. So he knew that in 1933, when they contracted the money supply, that was the wrong way to go. And he knew something drastic had to happen, that just cutting interest rates to zero in 2008 was not going to work. And so that's when they started the idea of buying bonds, which is what quantitative easing is. The Fed goes out and buys bonds and puts money into the economy. And so that's how that works. But even still, when they did that, the economy still was tanking in 2007, 2008, and in the Obama administration passed a $787 billion package and thought they'd keep unemployment below, I think, 8 or 9%. And it still went above 10%. So some question, does quantitative easing really even work? And even Ben Bernanke said, well, sometimes it works in practice, but not in theory. I don't really know what that means. That sounds like he must have been talking to Alan Greenspan. Where are we going to go from here? When we talk about that in coupling with, as we said, we're in a global economy with the supply chain, and that we are starting to bring some stuff back to be produced here, which during a time when we're having inflation issues could be a problem. How are the American people going to, who are going to feel the most pain from this, going to have to deal with that? I mean, we're seeing gas prices. I think it was J.P. Morgan predicted that with the summer driving season coming up, that gas prices would be over $6 a gallon by August. And we don't see the war in Ukraine necessarily subsiding. I think I read this morning that Russia took over another city and is controlling another part of Ukraine. And you don't think about Ukraine, right? It's this little country that we don't really think about till Russia really invaded it. But Ukraine produces, I think it was was it a third of the world's wheat? Wasn't a third? No. Yeah, Russia and Ukraine. Excuse me. Yeah, Russia and Ukraine together supply a third of the world's wheat. And it's already skyrocketing prices in Africa and Asia. Diamond says more that you're going to be right. You're going to be looking at something they're going to be writing history books about for 50 years, girding huge volatility in the markets. I don't think he's wrong on that. I think he's right. I think that we are going to continue to see the last few days and the last week, the markets have been relatively calm. I look at if you're not familiar with it, it's called the VIX. It's the volatility index. It's basically what they call, for simpler terms, the fear gauge. If you want to know how afraid the markets are, look at that, the VIX. It bounces anywhere from 10 to 12 in calm times to up to 40 to 50, and sometimes like during when COVID hit, it was hitting, I think it was like 70 or 80. Tremendous fear, right? We saw the markets tank then. So I think we are going to be in for some pain in the next couple of years. And if we look at what the government's spending, and then we look at in 2025, all the Trump tax cuts are going to settle. Which I think is going to cause more. I think it's going to be. It's going to cause. I don't say cause any pain, but I think that corporate taxes were at 35% at the time before that, and cutting them to 21 or whatever number. I think it makes sense as far as keeping that in line with other industrialized countries and what they charge, what tax rate they charge their corporations. Because I think it was Apple that had something like $140 billion in another country, and at the time, Trump wanted that to come back to this country. But that's getting off the topic a little bit here. But as again, with the unwinding of this balance sheet, as I said, they think that's going to affect interest rates, act like a quarter point a month, but they really quarter point higher than what the already pronounced half a point rate cut is going to do. But we don't know what's actually the outcome, what's going to happen with that. I mean, right now what they're doing is not, because they hold all the bonds and the coupons that they get paid, they're not reinvesting that money. So they're starting to deleverage right now, but they just haven't started selling that $95 trillion back. That's starting in September. And something else that I believe I mentioned briefly, that tech companies have put out more pink sheets since 2020. There was 16,800 pink sheets. That's 13,600 layoffs across 52 companies. That's the most since May of 2020. So we're seeing layoffs in the tech industry, and I think it was Tesla that didn't they announce they're going to lay off 10% of their workforce. So things like that reverberate through the country. So I don't know. So I don't know where we're going to go from here as far as bringing this economy back around. And as I mentioned in the last section, you know, when we couple that with aging population and slowing birth rate, I think long term, you know, it could be slow. So to wrap things up, as I said, and I think you get my point that we really don't know what's going to happen. We heard Jerome Powell say he has no idea what's going to happen. But if you want to learn more and about what we do and how we do it, as I said, we look for 3 different things. We look for changes in technology, changes in demographics, and changes in lifestyle to find the companies that are going to the companies that we want to invest in. You know, you can find us at www.adamsfinancialconcepts.com. You can call me at 206-858-3885 if you want to learn more about what we do and how we help our clients and how we've helped our clients beat the market over the last 17 years. We stay invested. One thing about us is we don't get out of the market. Even right now, we're down like a lot of people, but we stay invested through the market. We stay invested through downturns. We don't get scared in situations like this. So if you're looking for help and you're trying to, figure out where to go, give us a call or go to our website. It's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Thank you for listening. Mike and I will be back next week.